Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Demand Climate Justice, the global campaign to demand climate justice's daily press conference. Today, we're going to be focusing on what the global north needs to do to have a breakthrough in Baku, not only on the new collective quantified goal, but there's plenty of other issues on the table: mitigation work program, just transition, UAE dialogue, everything at stake still as we finish the last day or Friday of the first week of COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan. On my left, I will introduce them, but then say a few more words by introduction. But first is Mariama Williams from the Global Afro-Descendant Climate Justice Collaborative from the Caribbean, but currently also very active in the United States. And Jamie Minden from 0 Hour, a youth organization that has been around for a few years now, and Jamie is the acting director, but also a full-time student. And so, yes, here we are, first day of the end of the first week in COP29, and it's the same story that we've been seeing, you know, the north-south dynamics, but to share some of the details of where we are locked currently, not only what's going on in the negotiating rooms, but we want to connect it to some of the political dynamics back home. As the world knows, the United States recently re-elected former President Donald J. Trump, now President-elect again, to be taking office in January 2025. His team's proposed Project 2025 would not only pull out of the Paris Agreement, but possibly the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the core of their economic policy being what they call drill, baby, drill, thinking that the tariffs and other punitive measures that the U.S. could impose on other countries could be offset by lower energy costs. The way they would do this would be through, of course, deregulation, National Environmental Protection Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, all the regulatory tools that our government has to control emissions and reduce fossil fuel production, as well as fast-tracking more permits and pipelines and infrastructure for fossil fuels, not so much domestic use, but now export. The U.S. being the largest exporter, actually producer of oil, crude, and now natural gas in the world. We produce 50% more than Saudi Arabia. Everybody thinks the Saudis the biggest. The U.S. has grown exponentially over the past decade and now produces 150% of what the Saudis produce, driving down prices and making it more difficult for countries dependent on crude oil to have the income to finance their own transition from fossil fuels. So, but yet here is the U.S. Pushing the historic Dubai decision, transitioning from fossil fuels, telling the world that the North Star of policymaking needs to be 1.5 degrees Celsius, keeping within that limit, the temperature goal, while we continue to expand our own fossil fuels production at home. I will share also some of the details, or rather, I'll let our guests do that, but that's just to kick it off. We can come back to the climate finance and the NCQG discussion as well. But Mariama, would you like to go first? Jamie would like to go first. Okay.
That's sweet, thank you. Good morning, my name is Jamie Minden, and I'm a 21-year-old student from the United States and the acting executive director at 0 Hour, a youth climate justice organization. As Victor said, the United States is the world's leading producer of oil and gas and the largest historical emitter of fossil fuels globally. Therefore, I'm going to focus today on practical actions my nation can take to reduce its extremely outsized impact on the destruction of our planet's ability to sustain life. We must begin by reiterating the extreme limitations and threats of a Trump administration to the nation's ability to address the climate crisis. The Trump administration is projected to cause an addition of 4 billion tons of carbon to the atmosphere, as our future president has sold the keys of our future to his cronies in the oil and gas industry. The Biden administration, like every Democratic administration before it, has regrettably refused to substantively begin the phase-out of oil and gas while they had the power to do so, as well as consistently slow down and block progress on fair share's climate reparations, and now we are in the position of pleading with the White House to protect their climate legacy. Fortunately, there are a handful of actions that the White House can take right now and that members of Congress can support to block Trump's reckless and homicidal expansion of fossil fuels. First, and with the utmost urgency, the White House has until November 18th to pressure Exim to agree to end fossil fuel support of the export credit agencies at the OECD negotiations beginning this Monday. An OECD agreement would have a significant climate impact, shifting $40 billion per year of funding of new fossil fuel projects to funding for renewables. This financing of export credit agencies has been a key enabler of the LNG boom, supporting over 80% of new LNG export terminal projects built from 2012 to 2022. The Biden-Harris administration is committed to ending public support for fossil fuel projects and lead negotiations on an OECD agreement. This commitment is enshrined in both administrations' guidance and multilateral commitments made by Biden himself on a global stage. And this action is also powerful because it would be Trump-proof. It is if the proposal to end an export finance was agreed to next week, it could only be undone by all of the negotiating countries agreeing. A new Trump administration would not be able to undo this agreement under WTO organization rules and would be forced to adhere to it. This is the Biden administration's last chance to take this action. And the U.S.'s leadership role is critical to reaching this agreement. The White House leadership was indispensable in securing this coal agreement in 2015, and will be critical to bringing folks on board now. Next, before Trump takes office, President Biden must reject all pending liquefied natural gas permits to stop what is arguably the world's biggest carbon bomb. LNG is not a clean fuel, as industry cronies are attempting to claim. It is at minimum 33% more warming to our planet than domestically produced coal, according to the Hallworth study, and is a death sentence to frontline communities and ecosystems along Louisiana and the Texas Gulf Coast. The U.S. must also stop the expansion of fossil fuels, including blocking the Dakota Access Pipeline, which is currently operating illegally. Our climate is on the brink of collapse, and it is sheer madness that politicians continue to expand fossil fuels and subsidize them. The United States, along with other countries in the global north, such as France and China, must cease all financing of fossil fuel projects in the global south, particularly the East Africa crude oil pipeline, which, along with recklessly expanding fossil fuel projects while our planet is on the brink of 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, puts people in a lot of danger. It puts the drinking water of 40 million people at risk by threatening Africa's biggest freshwater basin, and is already starting to displace hundreds of thousands of people, while opposing voices are brutally beaten and jailed without bail. Next, the United States must position an arms and oil embargo on Israel, given the genocide and ecocide that the Israeli government is committing in Palestine. Finally, the U.S. owes the Global South a strong monetary commitment to fair shares in climate reparations with no loans or false solutions. These actions will quite literally save lives. The longer the Biden administration can delay the adoption of Trump's climate plans, the more time frontline communities will have with their loved ones, and the more time the rest of the world has to attempt to keep global temperature increase from rising catastrophically above 1.5 degrees Celsius. Thank you.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Mariama Williams. I'm with the Global Afro-Descendant Climate Justice Collaborative, and we are working to consolidate the voices and presence of Afro-descendants all over the world, because the data shows from the People's Permanent Forum that wherever we are located in the Americas, Europe, or Asia, we are at the margin of society. We are the ones who are suffering from land loss, living in suffering from land loss and suffering from living in areas that are near polluted sites and toxic sites, so suffering from respiratory disease, heart disease, and a whole bunch of other ailments that are affecting Afro-descendants wherever you look, from the Caribbean, from North America, Canada, Birmingham, Berlin, wherever we are suffering incredibly from climate change. So that's the goal of this entity. With regard to what the North can do, I think I'm really happy that Jamie went first, because I think she's really put on the table really what are the critical things that in particular the US, but all developing countries need to do, all developed countries need to do. Specifically, in this context right now, the negotiation context, we need for them to fulfill their climate finance pledge, and not just the NCQG, but to deal with the shortfall from the $100 billion. Every year since 2009 to 2023, I listened yesterday to the finance, high-level climate finance, and all the developed countries were very happy. Oh, for the first time, we have surpassed the $100 billion for 1 year. This pledge has been on the table since 2009. So there's been shortfall every year. So that's a debt that's outstanding. That's beyond the climate debt. So they need to deal with that, as well as deal with the new quantitative goal. So I think that's the first thing to really build trust, to acknowledge and accept. Cannot be patting themselves on the back for making 1 year. And that's questionable. So I'm just using the OECD figures, because we know that Oxfam and other researchers are showing that actually that 100.1 billion that they're self-congratulating themselves about is not quite as real as they would like to pretend. So we need for them to own up to the outstanding debt that they promised and put on the table, and in that return got developing countries to make a lot of commitments that we're now having to implement. And with each of these conventions, what we see is developing countries get more obligations, and developed countries are able to escape their responsibility. And that is what you're seeing occurring now with the push to say, yes, we have made our $100 billion goal. Now we need new contributors. We need to widen the contributors' base. Deal with what you owe, deal with your responsibilities, and then we talk about how to move forward in other directions. So I think these are very critical. The other thing, apart from the money in this context, is how we deal with the external factors that are impacting climate decision-making in developing countries, trade and debt. We need to see the OECD countries really step up to the plate and reform the World Trade Organization, reform the MDBs. And I don't mean the governance structure changing here and there. I mean systematically introducing justice, climate justice, reparatory justice, and procedural and distributive justice in all across the institutions of governance of macroeconomic policies, because these macroeconomic policies are at fault for increasing poverty and affecting the fiscal space that developing countries need to have. So unless we see movement also on trade and debt, then we can't take anything that is said in this space about new contributors. Where do new contributors get money? I think Victor has pointed out the irony of the US being a global producer in oil and that impacting others, where we know that in my region, Guyana has discovered oil. And so the idea is that, we'd like for them as civil society to keep it in the ground. But Ecuador also tried to keep it in the ground many years ago and didn't get any support from the global community. So we see this hypocrisy, this double-sided, triple-sided, quadruple-sided hypocrisy. And we need to really bring these to the surface and have our policymakers and our developing countries here not be blindsided or be bullied or pushed to say, let's make an agreement now because we have to do something. You must accept something now because Trump is coming. And I'm sure we saw that in 2016. When Trump was coming, we accepted many things. Trump came, left, and we're still here. And my real concern is that developing countries are not bullied by the American delegation here into accepting lower expectations on the ground that we must do something now, let's sign something now before Trump comes. Biden still has only have 2 months. Apart from what Jamie has mentioned, within the regard of this context, I think we have to be very careful about being pushed to accept lower level expectation on the idea that Trump is coming. So we need to stand our ground and demand what we need. So I'm going to pass it on to Victor.
Thanks, Mariama. We have about 8 minutes left. And just before we move to questions, and I would just like to connect it to what we see happening in the negotiating room. In the NCQG, we continue to see the U.S. trying to dilute some of the responsibilities, there is the opportunity at the end of this year that President Biden, who needs to make some deal on the budget with Congress, that there could be maybe $500 million, $500 million that they get and give to, for instance, the Green Climate Fund or various climate finance channels. But it's yes, we do need to deliver on our outstanding commitments that we failed to do, but it's really not much money, and so developing countries need to ask, is it worth making the changes the U.S. is trying to get for that little amount of money? We see, for instance, in the Just Transition Work Program, they are asking to delete references to the Paris Agreement, to the Framework Convention on Climate Change, replacing it with what they call the UN climate regime. So I don't know, are they preparing the world for the Trump withdrawal from the whole system? It's not clear. In Mitigation Work Program, they continue to grandstand and push the paragraph 28 from the Dubai decision on the global stocktake, which calls for the transition from fossil fuels. But like Jamie and I were talking about, continuing to expand at home, even though there are a number of measures they could take to begin winding down production, and ending expansion is the first step. We continue to be the biggest, not only biggest historical emitter, biggest current producer, but also planning to expand the most production as well, more than all other countries combined when it comes to LNG. And in terms of how to pay for it, we'll point you to the report that our DCJ member, Oil Change International, that points to where $5 trillion is in northern budgets. It's in military budgets. It's in ending fossil fuel subsidies. It's in transition of the financial system, of the trade rules, of debt cancellation. So it's not like the money is not out there. It's purely a question of political will, and that's where we need the North to stand up to its commitments and deliver on them. So 5 minutes left. Let's turn now to looking for any questions coming from prioritizing people from the press. And if not, we know a lot of folks are watching this online as well. People sit at their desks in the press center. So if there are any other questions, we'd be happy to take them. We have 5 minutes. And if not, then maybe one.
Good morning, Julian Rengel for El Diario R from Argentina. You mentioned previously on Twitter Space from DCJ that the global north would be acting as a bully towards the global south. What will happen if eventually there is a complete withdrawal from the UNFCCC by the US? How do you expect that this could impact on global trade? Thank you.
Sorry, it was hard to hear with the feedback. How would the withdrawal of the U.S. from the
If the rest of the world wants to continue within the convention and the U.S. is out, how can that impact on global trade?
On global trade?
Would there be some sort of boycott towards dealing with a larger emitter who doesn't want to commit?
Mm-hmm. On global trade, if the U.S. were to pull out of the climate convention, well, I guess we would want to see what the world does in terms of a reaction. I mean, if there are measures against U.S. Fossil fuel exports, for example, Europe faces a big decision. We can anticipate that President Trump will want to sell American gas to Europe. And maybe part of a Ukraine deal he would do would be to require Europe to take U.S. gas, which has big impacts on communities of color, particularly on the Gulf Coast, places that have been impacted by environmental racism for decades, and that continue to feel those impacts today. Do others have?
I would Say, if the U.S. pulled out of the, well, we've had an experience, right? We have 2016 when Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement. If the pulling out of the convention is a little bit more complicated than pulling out of the Paris Agreement, that's going to take years. But if the U.S. industry, and it seems, I'm not sure, but I've just been skimming the news, and not a lot of U.S. industry who do global trade are actually jumping on the bandwagon, because the EU has a carbon border adjustment mechanism, right? So even if U.S. firms intensify their carbon in their export, they will hopefully meet restrictions in entering markets in Europe and other places, right? So there are different considerations for industries. But I think within the context of this discussion, I think countries will continue on with their negotiation and continue on with their agreements. Some countries, we have already seen that Argentina has decided to pull out. I don't know why, can't speculate. So some countries may follow. But I think for most countries, especially in our region in Africa, we'll continue because we believe in the multilateral system, even though I have my own skepticism about that. But countries generally tend to believe that they're safer in a multilateral system, even with all of the negatives, than trying to go it alone. So I think you'll see that countries will try to move forward. We also have to remember that we're not in a unipolar world anymore, right? We have BRICS. We have a multipolar world, and we have a whole bunch of different contending forces that are outside of this process, and so it'll be interesting to see how that development go. And so that's some of the real interesting dynamics for me, is this multipolar world that is emerging, and that means that the U.S. is no longer the top dog. They still have the military might, they still have the dollar, but in terms of global trade, BRICS is coming along, and we'll see, yeah? But I think one other thing I want to point out, in this discussion, I hear a lot about the private sector, and I want to draw your attention to private sector, that there's a report that was released this week by the Global Sustainable Investment Alliance. It's called Transforming Global Finance as Financial Action, Addressing Misalignment in Incentive and Unlocking Opportunity. And they point out 5 reasons why private capital is not flowing. And they're saying that governments have unrealistic expectations, and they don't understand investment decision making. So we need to also use that to counter these guys who are saying, oh, we need to mobilize private capital. Well, private capital is not flowing for very specific reasons that we need to look at. Yes, Jamie?
Oh, no.
Okay.
Okay, we got to wrap it up there. Thank you very much, everybody. See you again tomorrow at this time.
Forget anything? Thank you. I need, may I take 1 minute of your time?